All right, welcome back for another episode of the Unplanned Show. And today with me, I have Bryon Kroger, founder and CEO of Rise 8. Bryon, you want to say hello? Before we get into it, I'll go over upcoming episodes, but maybe really quickly, you could explain a little bit about what Rise 8 is and also where the name came from, because I love this story.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. And thanks for having me. So, Rise 8 is a software services firm in the GovTech space. We help our customers achieve elite software development using the DORA metrics. So, big focus on helping them upskill their organizations and do transformation through doing versus a more traditional consulting approach. And Rise 8 comes from the Japanese proverb, fall 7 times, stand up 8. One of my favorite books is Grit by Angela Duckworth, and she said if she ever got a tattoo, it would be "Fall 7, Rise 8." It's a proverb about transformation and standing up larger than when you fell. So I had to go with it.
Awesome. Well, just to kind of give folks a heads up on what's coming up on the Unplanned Show, next week we'll have Andres Vega, who's on the Cloud Native Computing Foundation's security technology group tag. So that'll be an interesting episode. Then we have a week off for March 11th. I'll be out in London at Monkey Graw that week. So give me a shout if you're going to be in London going to Monkey Graw. Looking forward to that event. We'll be back on March 18th with Davis Godbout and Chris Bell talking about major incident management and what does that mean. And then on March 25th, we will have April Song from Databricks. She's going to be talking about ML ops. So that's definitely a hot area with everything around artificial intelligence, but how do you operationalize and bring those capabilities to life? So I'm looking forward to learning from her about ML ops. So always, you can tune in on the podcast version to hear the audio versions after they are live. But today, let's dig in a little bit with you, Bryon. One of the things that you've been posting about on LinkedIn that I think is really interesting is definitely around the role of platforms in what you've been seeing and doing in the GovTech space. And I wanted to start by stepping back and asking you just the high level, without getting into yet like where and how, but just why. Like, why do platforms make sense in the GovTech space? I think it's relevant for more than that, but I'm just curious, kind of from your point of view, you're deep in a specific area. Why do platforms make sense and really help organizations?
Yeah, it's I would say particularly in high compliance spaces, there's a lot of additional things that I'll get into maybe as we delve deeper into platform. But at a high level, obviously, platforms are providing that level of abstraction that to use the team topologies kind of layout, stream-aligned teams can leverage these platforms to be able to ship continuous delivery to end users. That's my big goal, right? I want to enable continuous delivery of valuable software that users love. And DevOps, we've been talking about DevOps for a long time now. It was really a promise of cross-functional collaboration between software development and operations. Platform is really the memorialization of that cross-functional collaboration, right? Built into code. And at least that's what it's supposed to be. One of the things that I'm finding is that almost everywhere we go, platform has become an opinion unto its own, right? Software or technology for technology's sake. And it's not as focused on that continuous delivery of valuable software to end users. We've got like infrastructure people that want to run infrastructure rather than infrastructure people that want to run apps for users. And so I've been harping on this for a minute now, because in the GovTech space, it manifests as a huge amount of wasted resources, taxpayer dollars. And not only are we wasting money, but in the GovTech space, the cost of delay isn't, profits and revenues, and, you're not getting disrupted on the Fortune 500. The cost of delay is often measured in lives or impeding critical services like the economic employment division in California and the distribution of unemployment benefits during COVID, or in the case of the DoD, I do a lot of work in the DoD. Very literally can be measured in lives, as well as with Veterans Affairs and all of these critical missions. And the last place we can afford to be disrupted, obviously, would be on a battlefield. God forbid we ever end up in that scenario. So getting platform right is really important. But it can go from being this critical enabler to your biggest time and money suck if you're not careful with it.
Yeah, that's a tricky double-edged sword, right? To sort of find that balance in. So I want to explore both sides of that, and let's start with kind of the why before we get into the how not to do it. And you talked about platforms being an opportunity to memorialize those goals of DevOps as measured in the DORA metrics, but I also liked the way you described enabling continuous delivery of valuable software that users love, and really bringing the user back in the picture. Um, what are some of the things that seem like uh, uh, get in the way of that platforms do help with? And so why are platforms so important for being able to achieve that type of goal? And just to, give you a little bit of where I'm coming from, I'm thinking about sort of the broader developer experience challenge and how overwhelming. It's interesting to hear you talk about tech for tech's sake, because part of the problem seems like an overwhelming amount of choices for developers, which also leads to a tremendous amount of complexity in production. So back to your both the dev side and the ops side having to kind of work together, there's a cost on both sides. So tell me a little bit more about how does that manifest in the GovTech space, and does that change the criticality of a platform approach?
Yeah, I don't know if it changes it. The way that we think about the why and the metrics are still the same. I think they just get greatly exacerbated, especially on a few key areas. So I love the CNCF white paper, actually. And maybe we'll talk about the CNCF landscape and how difficult it can be to string together things from the CNCF landscape. But the white paper itself is incredible. I always refer people to it. But some of the whys they mention are like reducing cognitive load on product teams to accelerate product delivery, development and delivery, improving the reliability and resiliency of products, right? Most application developers are, they're not SREs. And so when you're building products for the enterprise, or, a very bureaucratic enterprise like GovTech, that reliability and resiliency, the scale at which you're operating and the criticality of your services, reliability becomes a first-class feature. I say feature intentionally, along with security, right? So another one of the things that platforms do is they can help you reduce risk from security perspective, but also regulatory and functional issues through governance. Accelerating product delivery, obviously one that I already mentioned, that comes primarily through reusing and sharing platform tools. And then there's the making you more cost effective and efficient through productive use of various services from the cloud, other managed offerings, as well as internal things that you might develop. But then you're able to maintain control over the developer experience, as you mentioned, versus going straight to, like, say, a cloud provider.
Mm. I want to come back and double click on, you mentioned that you were intentional with saying reliability as a first class feature. So tell me
Mhm.
about why you choose that type of wording.
Yeah, so I think in the enterprise, and not just in the enterprise, I will say MVP used to be much more accepted in the early days of everybody moving towards more of an agile or DevOps approach. And it certainly can still be managed from a user expectation perspective in the direct to end user type of products. But when you're in the enterprise, that just doesn't fly. I really love Parker Conrad, the CEO of Rippling. He gives a really great talk. He says like the lean startup approach isn't always viable, and he's targeting an enterprise customer or enterprise customers with Rippling, and he went with what he calls a compound startup approach. And so the idea being going really wide with breadth and then really high on the reliability and security aspects. So when you're targeting the enterprise, you have to do that. The enterprise user, think of defense, for instance. Could you imagine showing up to a battlefield with a product like the MVP has like a low reliability score and poor security? Like take that to Ukraine. It's not practical at all in the space that I operate in, but I think that's true of every large enterprise now. They expect the MVP to have security and reliability as first-class features from the beginning.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, and I'm curious about this compound approach with the wide and deep. Let's come back a little bit to what's kind of getting in the way, right? And where are folks in the spirit of trying to take a platform approach, then making some missteps or, kind of getting in their own way or just other challenges that they might face?
Yeah, the biggest one is just not understanding what platforms are. Platforms to me are like the new enterprise service bus. We used to have really complex architecture diagrams, and then everybody started drawing one box called the ESB, and you just hide all your complexity in there, but you can't actually hide complexity, right? I feel like today that space is platform, although we still see enterprise service buses. They're usually labeled event streams now, but the idea is you can't hide that complexity, and you have to tackle it one way or another. But organizations are embarking down their platform journey without an accurate understanding of engineering estimates and the costs associated with it and the timelines. And so, everybody's always trying to balance things like vendor lock. And I always point people to a really great article in the Martin Fowler blog called I think it's "Don't Get Locked Up, Avoiding Locked In" by Gregor Hope. Because lock-in's not all it's cracked up to be. Is like sometimes there are acceptable forms of lock-in, and I've become a really big proponent that you shouldn't build what you can buy and you shouldn't buy what you can rent, and that you can carefully mitigate most forms of lock-in when it's not certain vendors that hire more lawyers than software developers and they're actually legally locking you in. Most of it's just switching cost. And so people get so wrapped up in avoiding vendors that they go down this very bespoke, like I'm going to string together, configure, integrate, deploy, and operate the entire CNCF landscape by myself. And that takes literally an army of engineers. And if you look at most of the modern PaaS companies, like the Kubernetes PaaSes, they have thousands of engineers on their R&D teams. And so unless you're prepared to invest thousands of engineers, you probably shouldn't try to entirely DIY your platform. And instead, a more thoughtful approach would be choosing commercial solutions that work for you, maybe even a Kubernetes PaaS if you're going down the Kubernetes route. And then building bespoke capabilities around that are differentiators within your enterprise, either strategic differentiators from like what you're offering to customers or internal ones. Like sometimes people have legacy IT systems that you have to figure out how to work around. But those are the two main areas. And I kind of, I'm a sucker for analogies. I know you do a lot of like tech debt analogies. I do gardening ones. There's this really great documentary called The Biggest Little Farm. And these people embark on this like permaculture journey. They're going to start this farm of their dreams, and everybody thinks that's going to be easy. I grew up in Iowa, farm kid. Farming is really difficult work. And there's all kinds of people nowadays that are like rediscovering farming, and they think they're just going to go start a farm in a year and they're going to be selling at the farmer's market and they're going to be happy and joyful. But these folks go through this journey of just like every time they achieve equilibrium on their farm, a new constraint pops up, right? It's just nature always has this equal and opposite reaction. That's what the platform journey is like. Every time you solve one developer bottleneck, a new one pops up. And before long, you realize why these commercial platform providers have thousands of engineers because there are so many bottlenecks that you have to deal with from a developer experience perspective. And in the enterprise, as opposed to the startup, um, these are often exaggerated because there's low developer maturity. So a lot of times the people building the applications or user-facing capabilities um, are immature from a development capability standpoint, or they're contractors, but they're usually low-rate contractors, not high-end ones. Um, and then all of the security and compliance that has to be built into the platform. So it just really exacerbates this problem.
Yeah. Um, I think you bring up a really good point also around this notion of like, this is not a one and done type of thing. You don't just like, we're going to lay down a platform, slide the keys across the table like it's a used car dealership, have fun, kiddo, and we're done. Um, you're suggesting about how when I liked your analogy of like you deal with one constraint and then another constraint is going to come at you next. There are a lot of implications in terms of also just your staffing, um, and how do you think about that ownership of the platform. So just want to hear your thoughts a little bit there about how does that play a role in having a successful approach to building a platform that is going to be viable.
Yeah. So a few things. One, you need to be very honest about your developer maturity. So who are the people that are going to be deploying on this platform and what do they need? Um, my experience in most of GovTech is they need Heroku, right?
Mm.
Like that's the level of develop, not only the level of development we're at, but also just when you think about the number of teams deploying on something like a government platform, even if it's just for the VA or just for the Air Force or the Space Force, abstraction is costs that are not incurred, right? They're centralized. So they're not incurred for every dev team. So instead of cost times n number of dev teams, it's just cost once, and then all the dev teams can leverage it. Well, when you have 10 teams and you're in like a small startup, that's not a big deal. When you have 1,000 teams, now it's 1,000x the cost for every abstraction you're not providing in your platform. And so not only is there a development maturity thing to consider, but there's also the number of teams that are leveraging a given capability. And that manifests not only in the cost to develop on the platform, but also in the compliance side. I saw you have Andres coming on. I just love his work. There's this thing in the enterprise where you can't deploy to prod until you've met the compliance requirements, unless you're doing shadow IT, right? And so every team has to complete all the compliance requirements. So I call this, there's the cost to develop on the platform. There's also the cost to comply on the platform. And similarly, just like, certain technical capabilities, for every security or compliance abstraction you don't provide, you have to multiply the cost of that times the number of dev teams again. And so it keeps compounding the amount of money you spend by not providing centralized platform capabilities to the teams. And that's why the state of the enterprise is what it is today, right? There's no platform, and that's why people take so long to deliver to production. And the capabilities are so bad because the cognitive load on them, they're worried about everything from, NIST RMF compliance in the government, or Sarbanes-Oxley in finance, or whatever it is. All, managing their Kubernetes infrastructure, standing up their own VPCs, all this stuff, right? Instead of just focusing on like, here's my source code, to quote Ansi's haiku, here's my source code, run it in the cloud for me, I don't care. I just want to focus on what my users need. So giving those abstractions the weight that they deserve from a very financial, like business perspective, is something that's important. And I would again refer people to the platform's white paper. They identify, I think it's like 13 critical capability areas of a platform. And when you delve into each one of those, I recently gave a talk where I just said, let's just assume each one of these capability areas is one team in your organization. Just add up the FTE costs of that, right? 13 teams. Most teams, if they have a senior Kubernetes engineer on them, you're going to be looking at least $1 million a year just in run rate. per team, so 13 million. But when we see that in government, that's on the low end. I'm seeing these things rack up bills of over $100 million a year in GovTech.
Okay. And just to address, we got a question coming in on the Twitch chat. Wondering if this is a new game. But no, we're talking about platforms for application developers here today. And I think you're really hitting the nail on the head around the basic concept of economics, platform economics, and how that is that I choose the words no worries on video game announcement. Just stop by another time, maybe. The sorry, I'm just seeing the chats keep coming in. The where was I? So platform economics and just I want to say the words the business decision, right? And so like how but I know that that's kind of a funny word to use in GovTech, but it is a business decision. Maybe economic decision is a more inclusive way of referring to it. About you want to think long term. And to your comment earlier about where folks can sometimes trip up is they're not really thinking about the bigger picture in a way of what the platform is here to provide. So, okay. And you brought up some really interesting points and stuff we were kind of catching up about right before we went live around thinking about what is the piece that you really want to focus on from a bespoke perspective. What are those opportunities versus it's like a layer of platform on top of other platform choices, where constantly coming back to that question of like, how do we get the most economic leverage out of what we have to pay for once versus what we have to pay for, for every application we want to deploy, every user we want to support, every deployment we want to deploy, and how do we remove those unit costs and instead absorb them at a platform layer. But within that platform, the hidden box of complexity, there's actually sub-platform decisions. What are some of the things that you think of there around what are some things that seem like natural places for further finding like that platform vendor? You mentioned like, you could be using like a vendor for your Kubernetes platform itself. Or versus the things that are like, hey, this is really where you actually should skill up and have specific people on that, because it's going to be bespoke for your organization, for your mission, whatever it is.
Yeah, I think there's well, first you have to decide what kind of company you are, right? Like what is your value line? What value do you provide people? Because if you're not a platform company, you just probably shouldn't be building platforms at all. So that right off the bat, I mean, that's how I feel about most of government and a lot of large enterprises. For some of them, there is a bit of a platform play. And this is just areas where you want to provide a unique user experience. And I'm talking about your actual end users, your customers. And any time where there's business value in you providing a bespoke experience, then you should do it. Most users don't care about your IDAM solution, right? For instance, they care that it works. Like they want to have things like single sign-on. So they care about that, but they don't care that you're building it. And if you build one, is it going to be that much better than if you used Okta or some other identity provider? Probably not. And so these are really business decisions that end up getting made by technology people with no thought whatsoever for the business. Or in the case of the government for taxpayer money, right? And I think that's the first critical thing that you have to answer. Now, you'll find, I mentioned Rippling earlier, right? They're somewhat of a platform play. They're providing what I would call enterprise applications, but there are things about what they've done underneath those applications that provide a better value proposition to customers and make people like me excited to buy it. So those are worthwhile. Um, so things that they're doing with creating a unified data platform underneath all of their applications, as one example. And I think, though, generally, these conversations, when they're not being driven by technology, sometimes I see business leaders making the same decisions. And usually what's happening is somebody's trying to optimize for either what I mentioned, lock-in or cost, and they just don't understand the cost. So on the lock-in side, they'll be like, look, we can't go all in on AWS services, right? Because sometimes I might say, don't even use Kubernetes. You could use Lambda functions and probably save yourself millions of dollars for certain use cases. Now they also have use cases where it'll cost you way more money, so be careful if you're going down the serverless route. But they're so concerned with, well, we might end up locked into AWS and they're going to raise their prices on us. And they don't realize that even if that were to happen, the cost of insulating themselves from AWS right now costs more than the switching costs that they're afraid of, that they don't even know is going to happen. So that's like a risk-adjusted return conversation. So not just getting into raw costs, but real risk management. And I think I mentioned Gregor's article earlier. He does a really good job of showing a hypothetical curve of when those investments to isolate yourself from lock-in turn upside down and start becoming a cost center to you. And then that second piece then is the just not understanding the costs at all. Like, oh, I can build an IDAM and it'll be cheaper than Okta. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, that brings up a question for me. Is part of the issue when folks are kind of missing the cost picture? Is it because they're only looking at hard costs and they're not including soft costs, or are they completely missing hard costs as well because they're hiding in plain sight, if you will?
The biggest cost I see missed over and over again is FTEs. So whenever you're going to DIY, it moves into an FTE cost. And if you're doing that internal, that typically shows up on the books in a completely different place. It's almost hidden from the CFO. And so like the CFOs would normally, if you were using contractors, it would get flagged immediately because you'd be swapping out a license for a services contract.
Mm-hmm.
But when it ends up in payroll, it can get hidden really easily.
Yeah.
And so that's the biggest one that I see missed. And then along with that, the thing that drives up FTE costs to no end is day two, right? So everybody will go run a Kubernetes experiment, get a Hello World app running, and they're like, let's extrapolate costs from this. And even if they weren't just doing it with a Hello World app, maybe they used a real enterprise app that they modernized and threw in a container and whatever. Day two, it's not a linear scaling model. The goal in platform is to achieve sublinear scaling. And that's like people confuse SRE with DevOps all the time. And there's all these, so many words, but I would say the fundamental goal of SRE is to achieve sublinear scaling. How do you scale your platform usage without scaling the number of FTEs to support your platform in a linear capacity? But most people, not only do they not achieve sublinear scaling, when they get to day two, it's super linear. And so what was a 6-person platform ops team ends up becoming a 30 to 40 person day two ops team. And they can't respond to customer success or customer demands, and the developer experience and the user experience starts to tank, which are the two most important metrics I would say for a platform: user satisfaction, both developer and end user.
Yeah. That's a really great point about that, kind of coming back to that SRE goal. And again, it's that like being able to see around the corner of into the future of like, what is this end state that we're looking for? Just curious, like, what have you seen? Where have you seen this? Or you don't have to name names in terms of where, but like, what kind of environments and what kind of decisions have you seen organizations take that do help them set them up for being able to achieve that sublinear scaling in the day two and beyond kind of period?
Working primarily in GovTech and the enterprise, I'm dealing with mostly low development maturity application teams. And then the government usually is also hiring contractors to do both app development and this platform engineering and operations. And the level of talent they typically have access to, even via contracts, just because of the way government contracts work, is much lower than you might find in commercial. Same problems, but a fundamental lack of talent and maturity, primarily because of the rates government pays. So what I see most effective in that environment is folks that just fully embrace, don't build what you can buy, don't buy what you can rent. They want to rent as much as possible. Where they can't rent, they're going to buy it and deploy it, right? Where the vendor is responsible for SLAs around patching, upgrading, maintaining the CNCF landscape as an example, right? So if you would talk about a CNCF landscape-based PaaS, vendors doing all the integration when new APIs drop, right? Or a CVE drops, they're responsible for dealing with that, not you. You're just taking their bits, deploy and operate, deploy and operate.
Mm-hmm.
So that pattern I've seen be really successful over and over again. And then what's interesting though is there seems to be this wave, the pendulum swings back the other way, is those organizations achieve success and then everybody looks at it and they're like, great, how can we cost optimize this? Oh, look at those licenses. Let's get rid of those PaaS licenses. We could insource that because we know what we're doing now. And I've seen more than one. I have one egregious one that I gave a presentation on recently where they said they were going to reduce their platform costs. They spent the next 3 years and just over $150 million, and the platform still wasn't running in production. The old platform was still running in production. And at that point, that platform was actually end of life, right? And they were keeping it in minimum sustainment mode.
Mm-hmm.
And so this platform is running all of their apps for their users worldwide, getting no love whatsoever. Everybody talks crap about it, but it's still running all the workloads with like a 4 to 8 person ops team. And then meanwhile, they've got this 50-person organization over here burning piles of cash and can't get anything live. So I just say that story to say, in the enterprise, unless you can get high platform engineering maturity and high developer maturity, you really need to optimize for buying and renting, and building only where you absolutely have to. Government, it comes up a lot. It's like they use legacy Windows systems and they'll have like a legacy GAL situation. And so sometimes we see like, hey, yeah, figuring out a unique identity solution that can integrate with a modern platform, right? I'm going to use the modern platform, but I'm going to have to integrate our legacy identity provider over here from the network. That's a good use case for standing up a really small bespoke team.
That's a really useful and easy to remember, which is something I always love. The kind of like, hey, rent wherever possible, whatever's left over, buy where you can, and just leave the last bit as this is what you absolutely need to build. I feel like that's something tangible that folks can take away. And I think a lot of the things you're talking about in terms of simplifying to that, just having to deploy and operate as opposed to, manage the entire life cycle of every piece of the platform experience, which I keep coming back to this image you painted in my mind of the ESB box that's hiding like a whole scramble of stuff, because I totally know what you're talking about. And it's really important. And that I think you're right. Like it's sort of, the way people are talking about platforms, they're dropping it in as the same PowerPoint box in the middle there with a few lines coming in and out. But within that, like, how do you make these decisions? So that's a useful framework. And I'll be candid that some of the reasons I'm thinking about is because all of that, even just from like an incident management perspective, right? All of those are potential future incidents. And
Yes.
so thinking about like, this is something maybe not always related to this particular phenomenon, but PagerDuty has been around for a long time and helped a lot of organizations with managing incidents. And yet you continue to see, we just released our State of Digital Operations report a few weeks ago. And one of the insights there was enterprise had, I think, incidents growing at 16%. So it was outpacing the average. And it's like, this is not a new area. So the idea that like we have not solved this, coming back to your notion of the constraints, like you solve for one and it's going to pop up somewhere else, like that is very close to home. And someone has commented on what you just shared about how it's so accurate it hurts. But I think even looking at just purely from an incident management perspective, right? It's like we haven't, as much as we want to have solved this, we haven't. And part of it is because the environment you're operating in keeps changing. And if this will continue to exacerbate that as well. Like everything you're talking about, the pendulum swinging the direction of like, oh, let's try to cost optimize and like build this all ourselves, is like you are just opening up a whole new surface area of places where things can go wrong that your teams are going to be responsible for. So I know it sounds counterintuitive, but I see a lot of value in actually not having that. There's still going to be plenty of important things to deal with that you should be able to focus on. So sorry, there's probably should be a question in there somewhere. But I guess like just thinking about, I think that was a great kind of like pearl of wisdom and just like framework for thinking. Is there anything else that you would want to add to the discussion here around platforms? You've posted sometimes about like platform as product. And I think what you're talking about also about how do you maintain a business or economic point of view and sustain that even as a platform actually matures and delivers value, that you don't regress into losing that perspective. I would love to maybe hear like any thoughts on like how do you sustain that economic North Star, so that we don't kind of lose our way.
Yeah. I think again it goes back to your why. Like, what are you here to do, right? And if your engineering teams all think they're there to engineer, like that's not what they're there to provide value to. I won't say to their shareholders, right? To end users, to customers. Shareholder value is a result, not a strategy. The strategy is investing in your users and your employees, in this case, developers. So the developer experience, the user experience. And so all along the way, it should just be like, is this providing a better experience for our developers or our end users at a similar or lower cost? And when you do that, it drives fundamentally different platform discussions. Even the concept of platform as a product, it's like, platform is a product. Is it our product? Is that what we ship to our users? No. Like, maybe you ship, I've been working, I'm at a space thing out in LA right now. Like, you build space satellite comms. Like, that's what you provide. And so you need to figure out, how do I provide that as well as possible, at the best possible value for my customer? So continuous delivery, valuable software that users love. With that, I would say one thing that will help your platform organization achieve that is by putting designers in your platform organization. We finally started putting product managers, and not just like Kubernetes engineer or an other engineer that we made into a product manager, real product managers. So I'm seeing that, I'm hopeful, but we're still missing design. And I keep it vague when I say design, because you need, interaction design, UX design, user-centered design. You need a lot of different design disciplines. And I'm also a believer that design should be a part of the entire organization, not a silo. Or sometimes you see like product design and marketing design, but like design as a concept, what's the entire user journey? So if you have somebody in your organization that's responsible for your end user's journey, they'll be the first ones to point out, like, that's not an important part of the end user's journey, that we're using this distribution of Kubernetes. Like, okay, is that going to provide a better experience? If so, like, what's the cost of that? What kind of trade-offs are we making? And one other thing too that you said, that you talked about incident response. One interesting one, there's a government organization that has built this Kubernetes distribution with the CNCF landscape, and they have an umbrella Helm chart that has 12 Helm charts underneath it, and almost every one of those has a call to the other Helm charts. It's the most fragile thing you've ever seen, right? And so from an incident response, like, most of the outages and other incidents are all related to that. And that is a direct consequence of trying to build a Kubernetes distribution without the level of, say talent, it sounds mean, but like the level of engineering that you need to build something like that. And so the designers should not only be looking at the developer experience and the user experience, but I think there's another interesting one that we really haven't started exploring as much, which is, what's the operator experience? Because I end up using a lot of these commercial platforms that have really good developer experiences, but they're still difficult to deploy and sometimes operate. You don't see the same level of investment in operator experience as you do in developer experience. So that's maybe one that I would add. And then you need to then measure organizations on this. So the most important thing, as always, is like measure. Measuring platform success should be that user satisfaction and just general productivity that I mentioned. Organizational efficiency, but like actually knowing how to measure that. We've talked about some of the traps there. And then ultimately product and feature delivery. So I would use the DORA metrics there. Obviously, platform teams don't have direct responsibility for deploying apps.
Right.
But it's a pretty good indication if there's really strong deployment frequency, low lead time for changes, time to restore and change fail rate is good. That's indicative of a really strong platform.
Yeah. And that's a great point about how sometimes how do you get comfortable with embracing some metrics that, again, you aren't directly the team doesn't have direct responsibility for, because that can be uncomfortable. And so sometimes people avoid it and they want to only measure things that they're directly responsible for, that they feel like they can directly control. And yet that is where that myopia sets in, and you lose track of what the bigger goal was. And especially when you're talking about, if, to your point, it comes down to, a user experience, your part of it is putting a ball in someone else's court in terms of what are they going to do. User error, like, well, what can you take responsibility for? You can't just say it was user error, like, you design it better.
Yeah. These developers, the number of times I hear like, the developers are just too dumb to use our platform. It's like, maybe you should have built a different platform, like Platform for Dummies, instead of this complex Kubernetes distribution. To your point on metrics, I mean, you have a marketing background. It's becoming more and more common to measure marketers on revenue, which used to be unheard of. But in the era of cheap money is over. So nobody can live in their little silos just consuming piles of cash because the interest rates are so low. It just doesn't happen anymore. So you're seeing the entire industry, and platforms no exception to this, where people have to prove they're hitting the top line metric. Yeah. So like marketing, revenue, right? We're not just measuring MQLs anymore. It's like, are we actually getting revenue out of you? If not, you're getting cut. And so similarly, the platform should be viewed through a similar lens. Where's the value coming in?
Absolutely. And, just the other one, I'll make a quick plug for a previous episode we had with Sam Newman, because what you just described in terms of, the 12 Helm charts inside a master Helm chart that are all talking to each other. And, Sam had this great quip about, when we went to microservices, it was like we made every outage a murder mystery. And that's for the microservice that's actually delivering the feature to the user. Like, what you're talking about is like, you're even steps away from that. Like, you haven't even delivered necessarily any value to any real users yet. You're just trying to deliver the platform to the developers who can in turn deliver value. And if
Hmm.
you've got a murder mystery situation, every time something goes blip in that environment, like I'm just sort of connecting some of those dots. And also, you know me, I love my analogies and murder mysteries. That you really drove it home for me in kind of illustrating that point. So thank you. Um, we're just about out of time, and this has been a pleasure and always great to catch up with you, Bryon. So hopefully we'll have you back. If there's anywhere folks, if they want to learn more, get more of your hot takes and opinions, where should they find you and follow you?
I do most of my socializing on LinkedIn, so definitely follow me there and participate in the conversation. I love hearing from folks, especially outside of GovTech space. So
Mm.
would really love folks from the enterprise space or the larger commercial sector. Um, a lot to be learned from some of the other large enterprises and what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, folks, look out for Bryon on LinkedIn. I know I follow him as well. And I see you've got your video updates and some great hot takes and food for thought pretty much every week. So it's delightful. Thank
Thank you.
you. Thank you, folks, for tuning in, and have an uneventful rest of your day.